So I googled how much money is there in the world, and the answer is confusing because there is like a little over $8 trillion, but the total GDP of the United States, or the size of the US economy, is $30 trillion. How that makes sense? Well, it turns out that the $8 trillion refers to the amount of physical cash that exists, such as cash and coins. If you account the money that you have in your banks for day-to-day uses, such as the money that you use to pay for a Netflix subscription, then that is called M1 money, and it quickly grows up to $50 trillion. But it doesn't include like your savings account, the money that you keep in a fixed deposit. If you include all of that, then it's called broad money, or M2, and it quickly grows to $123 trillion. Why is there such a huge gap between the real amount of money that we have in the economy and the total amount of money that exists in the system? Because if you convert $123 trillion into real cash and coins, then it is going to cause massive inflation, the likes that we have never seen in history, and all money will simply become worthless. And that's the first thing that banks don't want you to know. Money is not real. It doesn't exist. These are just simply digits in the computers. I mean, it was real money when money was gold, or at least when the dollar was pegged to gold, but ever since, money is not real. It doesn't exist. It's unlimited. It can be created out of thin air. Here's my favorite way of how banks create money out of nothing. Let's say you have $10,000 and you go to a Citibank, open a savings account, and you deposit your $10,000 into a Citibank for a rainy day. God knows what happened, so that you have an extra money in case you decide to retire and you have some money to pay the rent. The next day when you wake up, you pull out your phone and you still see your $10,000. A week passes, you pull out your phone and you check your Citibank application and you see that you have your $10,000 in your savings account. But what the bank isn't telling you is that your money is not there in the bank. Yes, you can pull out your phone and check your savings account and you can see your money in the bank, but it's not there. The bank can make the application show you whatever the bank wants. So if you show up to the bank, the money isn't actually there. And that's why when everybody shows to a bank pulling out their money from their savings account, the bank fails. Remember Silicon Valley Bank? Everybody wanted to withdraw their money at the same time. The bank did not have the money and Silicon Valley Bank declared bankruptcy, and that's what we call a bank failure. If tomorrow everybody shows up to the Citibank and tries to withdraw their money, what do you think Citibank is going to do? They don't have the money, they will declare bankruptcy, and that will be the end of that. And that actually happens consistently. Like, bank failures are a very normal thing, and every single year there is a good number of banks that constantly go into failure and declare bankruptcy, simply because the money that you keep in the bank is no longer there in the bank. But wait a second, where does the money go when I actually keep it in the bank? You see, banks are not charity organization. Their job isn't to provide you for a safe place to park your money and withdraw it in case you want. Banks are businesses whose sole purpose is to make as much money as possible. And their business model is very simple. We take your money and we invest it and we make a lot of money while you believe that you have a place to park your money. And then they also pay you a miserable tiny little interest just to make you feel good, because you don't know how to invest your money. In fact, if you look at the entire society, there's like the top 10% of the society that actually knows how to invest, which is why they consistently keep investing and they make a lot of money. Well, the vast majority of people don't, which is why banks have plenty of fish to catch. So there's like 90% of the population whose money the banks can use in order to take and invest and make a ton of money. But there is one little problem. Banks are not allowed by law to invest all of your money. They have to keep 10% of your money in the bank just in case if you show up tomorrow and when you want to withdraw some of your money. Which is why they keep a fraction of your money and invest 90% of that. So when you went to the bank and you deposited your $10,000, the bank took $9,000 out of those savings and invested it or gave it as a credit card debt. And what is the average interest rate on credit cards? 27%. So if you take the total amount of credit card debt in the United States, it's about $1.2 trillion. So the banks are roughly making around $324 billion of pure cash just from credit card interest. And we did not even include car loans, personal loans, student loans, and mortgages. Do you see how quickly that number adds up and how much real money banks are making? So technically, your $10,000 is still there in the bank, but it's not, because $9,000 was invested by loaning it to someone else, which makes the total amount of money in the system right now $19,000. And that's the second thing that banks don't want you to know: fractional reserve banking. Only a fraction of your money is kept in the bank while everything else is invested. And it's not you who is getting the benefits of those investments. It's the bank that is profiting using your money, investing it, while you get a tiny fraction, maybe less than 1% in most cases. Let's say the bank loans that $9,000 to your neighbor who is a mechanic. So he has now $9,000. But it isn't exactly safe to walk around with $9,000 in your pocket. You can get robbed, you can get stabbed, and who doesn't want an extra $9,000? So your neighbor who is a mechanic takes $9,000 and comes back and opens a savings account in the exact same bank and deposits that $9,000 in the exact same bank. What do you think the bank does with this extra $9,000? Again, the banks are not there to protect their money. They take that $9,000, keep a fraction of it, which is 10%, and loan 90% of that, or $8,100, to someone else who needs it at a much higher interest rate. Let's say the bank loans that $8,100 to Jimmy who wants to buy a car. So he takes that $8,100, he goes to his friend who is selling his used Toyota and gives him that $8,100. His friend who just sold him the car to Jimmy can't walk around with $8,100. What if he loses that money? What if he gets robbed? So he takes that money and he goes to the exact same banks and he opens a savings account and he deposits that $8,100 into that bank account. Now, what do you think the bank is going to do with that $8,100? The bank is going to keep a fraction of that, which is 10%, and will loan everything else to someone else to make more money. And the cycle repeats over and over and over, where at the end of the day, the $10,000 that you deposited in JP Morgan or in this particular bank is going to turn into at least $100,000, if not more than that. And that's why there is just around $8 trillion of money within the system in pure cash that refers to real physical money, and $123 trillion of total money in the system. And that's why most money simply doesn't exist. It was simply created over and over. Now, there is more money within the system chasing the exact same amount of goods and services within the system. What happens to prices? Prices instantly increase. And that's what we call inflation. And that's the third thing that banks don't want you to know. Banks are taking your money and creating more money using the fractional reserve banking, creating inflation in the process, driving the prices of goods and services higher and higher. That devalues your initial amount of money that you deposited in the bank, and in the process, banks are making more money while the money that you deposited in the bank becomes less valuable over time. 20 years passes and you decide to retire. So you go to the exact same bank and you're asking, can I please have my $10,000 because I decided to retire? Yes, of course you can have your $10,000. But now your $10,000 can buy significantly less things. It lost 70% of its value. Just like the dollar lost 70% of its value over the last 20 years. But how about the bank? Did the bank lose money? Well, if we assume that the bank made 10% ROI on the money that you kept in that bank, that means that your $10,000 have increased to $67,275. Do you think the bank is going to share that money with you? Well, absolutely not. That money simply stays with the bank because the bank used that money to invest and not you. And you simply get your $10,000 that can buy 70% less things now. That's why banks don't want you to learn investing, because the moment you learn investing, you're not going to go and keep your money in the bank all the time. Yes, you might keep a fraction of your money because you might need that money, but overall you're going to use your money, you're going to invest it, and you will make a lot more money. And banks will go out of business because they don't have your money. And if everybody does that in the society, it's not the banks that will keep getting richer, but the people, just like the top 10% who consistently keep investing and make a ton of money. But wait a second, this whole system makes no sense whatsoever. Because if one bank owes money to the second bank, then the second bank owes money to the third bank, then the third bank owes money to the fourth bank. Where did the money initially came from? Because banks can't create money out of thin air from nothing. Where did the real money came? Because if we have a bank, for JP Morgan, for example, to use fractional reserve banking to loan you money, someone else is supposed to deposit money in that bank in the first place. So if I go and deposit money, then only JP Morgan can create money using fractional reserve banking. But what if nobody is depositing? What if we have a system or the entire economy where there is no money or whatsoever? Where does the money comes from in the first place? And that's why we have something called the Federal Reserve, or the Central Bank of the United States. And this is the only authority in the world that has the right to create dollars out of nothing. So the central bank creates that money and lends it to JP Morgan in form of a debt. And JP Morgan has to return this money back to the Federal Reserve. And this money is lent to them at an interest rate. Currently, the effective interest rates of the Federal Reserve is around 4.25% to 4.5%. So let's round it out to 4.5%. Which means that if the Fed is going to loan to JP Morgan $1,000, now JP Morgan next year have to give back the Federal Reserve $1,000 plus 4.5% in interest, and that's an extra $45. JP Morgan will take that $1,000 and will loan it to you in form of credit card debt, and the interest rate of credit card debts are 25%, which means that you have to give back to JP Morgan not just the $1,000 that you have borrowed, but you also have to give them a 25% interest, which means that an extra $250. Now JP Morgan will take this $1,000 and will return it to the Fed and will take 4.5% or $45 and pay to the Fed, and that will keep JP Morgan with $205 in pure profit, which means that any money that has entered the economy enters through banks from the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve never provides money to any bank unless it's a loan, which means that every dollar that exists within the entire system is debt. It's either created by the Fed and loaned to the banks, or it's created by the banks using fractional reserve banking as debt. And that is the fourth thing that banks don't want you to know, that every single dollar that ever exists in the system is a debt. But wait a second, how about my income? I work at my job and I get paid a paycheck at the end of the month, and I don't owe that money to anybody. I can do whatever I want with that money. And that's why we have inflation. As time goes by and banks keep creating more and more money, the value of existing dollars becomes less and less valuable. And over time, sometime in the future, that dollar can buy nothing because the dollar became so invaluable. And if your money can buy nothing, then it's the same thing as it vanished from the entire system. Isn't that system is genius? Either the money vanishes from the entire system because it loses its purchasing power, or the money is pure debt. Whoever came out with the system must be an absolute genius. But there is one way for the money to stop being debt. If you take that money, which is debt, and turn it into an asset or buy assets with it, then it's no longer a debt. Because every time, either it's through fractional reserve banking or direct printing money by the Fed, devalues the value of the dollar, what happens to prices of assets? Instantly, the prices of assets rise every time more money is injected into the economy. So we have to ask ourselves a completely different question now. What exactly is an asset? An asset is anything that creates value and money consistently. Is your car an asset? Well, your car helps you to get around. Without a car, it's probably difficult to get around. But your car constantly drains money out of your pocket. You have to change the oil, you have to fuel it every single week, you have to maintain it, you have to change the tires, and so on and so forth. So we hardly can call it an asset. But what about that corner shop that your uncle has purchased? If that corner shop brings more money than it drains money, then we can call it an asset. So an asset is any business that consistently generates income. Amazon, for example, sells products to millions of people all across the globe 24/7, 365 days in a year. Apple sells MacBooks, iPhones, iPads, AirPods to millions of people all across the globe 24/7, 365 days in a year. Facebook sells ads to businesses, to millions of businesses all across the globe 24/7, 365 days in a year. So over the last 20 years, as the value of the dollar lost 70% of its value, the value or the price of Amazon has increased by 12,000%. Over the last 20 years, dollar lost 70% of its value, while the price of Apple has increased by 15,000%. So money is either invested and it keeps creating more value, or it's either kept there somewhere in the bank and it disappears over time. And that's what the banks don't want you to know. Because instead of keeping your money in the bank, you will start investing it on your own and you will start building real wealth. And that means that banks will no longer make trillions of dollars out of you. Wait a second, are you suggesting me to go and open a bank? Well, fortunately, you don't have to open a bank to start investing. Anybody today can start investing and put their money to work. So for those who are very serious about investing, I have left a link in the description of this video that will help you get started. It will answer all of your questions. It will provide you with a practical path to start investing and build an investing strategy that will lead to generational wealth.